The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine grounds of Windsor Castle, as guard Thomas Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for what he believed would be another ordinary day. At 52 years old, Thomas had served the royal family for over 3 decades, standing silent and motionless at his post through countless ceremonies, state visits, and royal events. His weathered hands, now slightly trembling from years of holding heavy rifles, gripped his weapon with practiced ease. Thomas had dedicated his entire adult life to this service. He joined the Queen's Guard at 19, fresh-faced and eager to serve the crown. Back then, his uniform fit perfectly, his posture was ramrod straight, and he could stand for hours without feeling the ache that now crept into his joints. The years had been kind in some ways and harsh in others. He had witnessed history unfold before his eyes, stood guard during royal weddings, state funerals, and countless public appearances. But lately, things had become more difficult. His wife Margaret had been diagnosed with a serious illness 6 months ago, and the medical bills were mounting. Their small pension wouldn't cover the expensive treatment she needed. Thomas had been working extra shifts, picking up additional duties wherever possible, but it never seemed to be enough. The stress was showing on his face, etching deep lines around his eyes that hadn't been there just a year before. On this particular morning, Thomas was assigned to guard duty near the castle's east wing, where the younger members of the royal family often spent their time. It was considered one of the easier posts, as there was typically less foot traffic and fewer formal ceremonies. Thomas was grateful for this assignment, as his left knee had been bothering him more than usual lately. As he took his position, Thomas noticed the familiar sounds of the castle coming to life. Staff members hurried past with their morning duties. Gardeners tended to the immaculate lawns, and somewhere in the distance, he could hear the faint laughter of children. The royal family's younger generation was known to be quite active, often running through the corridors and playing in the gardens when their schedules allowed. Thomas tried to focus on his duties, but his mind kept wandering to Margaret. She had another doctor's appointment that afternoon, and he was worried about what they might discover. The treatments weren't working as well as they had hoped, and the doctors were talking about more aggressive options that would cost even more money. He had already taken out a second mortgage on their small home, but it wouldn't be enough to cover everything they needed. The guard uniform that had once been a source of immense pride now felt heavy on his shoulders, not because of its physical weight, but because of the burden of responsibility it represented. Thomas knew that hundreds of people depended on guards like him to keep the royal family safe. It was an honor that he had never taken lightly, but the personal struggles were making it harder to maintain the level of focus and dedication that the position required. As the morning progressed, Thomas found himself shifting his weight more frequently than usual. His knee was particularly troublesome today, sending sharp pains up his leg whenever he put too much pressure on it. He tried to maintain his composure, knowing that any sign of weakness could result in being reassigned or worse, being forced into early retirement. At his age, finding another job that would pay enough to cover Margaret's medical expenses would be nearly impossible. The castle grounds were unusually quiet today, with most of the senior royal family members attending an official function in London. This left the younger members at home, and Thomas could occasionally hear their voices echoing through the halls. He had always found their presence somewhat comforting. Despite all the formality and protocol that surrounded royal life, they reminded him that this was ultimately a family home. Thomas remembered when Prince George was just a toddler, barely walking and often accompanied by his nannies during garden walks. Now at 10 years old, the young prince had grown into an intelligent and observant child who seemed to notice everything around him. Thomas had observed from his various posts how Prince George would sometimes watch the guards with curious eyes, as if trying to understand their role and the solemnity of their duty. The pain in Thomas's knee intensified as the day wore on, but he remained steadfast at his post. He had learned long ago to endure discomfort without showing it. The training had been rigorous, designed to prepare guards for long hours of standing in all weather conditions. But training couldn't prepare someone for the emotional weight of watching a loved one suffer while feeling helpless to provide adequate care. As afternoon approached, Thomas could see some movement near the windows of the east wing. He maintained his forward gaze as protocol demanded, but his peripheral vision caught glimpses of activity inside. The young royals seemed to be engaged in some sort of indoor activity, possibly their afternoon lessons or recreational time. The weight of his responsibilities felt heavier than ever today. Thomas knew that his personal problems couldn't interfere with his duties, but the constant worry about Margaret was becoming harder to suppress. He had always been able to compartmentalize his personal and professional life, but the severity of his wife's condition and their financial struggles were testing that ability like never before. Despite his physical discomfort and emotional turmoil, Thomas maintained his professional demeanor. His fellow guards had always respected him for his dedication and reliability. Many of them were younger men who looked up to him as a mentor and example of what a career guard should be. The thought of disappointing them, or worse, compromising the safety of the royal family due to his personal distractions, was something Thomas couldn't bear to consider. As the sun reached its peak, casting shorter shadows across the courtyard, Thomas prepared himself for several more hours of duty. He had no idea that this day would be unlike any other in his long career, or that a small gesture from an unexpected source would change everything he thought he knew about service, dignity, and the true meaning of royal compassion. Prince George had been watching the guard from his bedroom window for most of the morning. At 10 years old, he possessed an unusual awareness for someone his age, often noticing details that adults missed or chose to ignore. His tutors frequently commented on his observational skills and his ability to ask thoughtful questions about the world around him. Today, something about Guard Mitchell seemed different. George had seen this particular guard many times before during his years at Windsor Castle. The man always stood perfectly straight, never moving except for the precise ceremonial movements required of his position. But today, George noticed something that made him pause in his studies and pay closer attention. The guard was shifting his weight slightly, favoring his right leg over his left. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but George had developed a keen eye for such details from years of observing the staff who worked tirelessly to maintain the castle and serve his family. He had learned from his parents about the importance of noticing when people were struggling, even when they tried to hide it. George's education had always included lessons about empathy and service to others. His parents, Prince William and Princess Catherine, had made sure that despite his privileged position, he understood the value of hard work and the dignity of all people, regardless of their role in society. They often spoke about how the guards, staff, and everyone who worked at the castle were essential parts of their extended family. From his vantage point at the window, George could see that Guard Mitchell was an older man, probably around his grandfather's age. The guard's face showed signs of strain that went beyond the physical demands of standing at attention for hours. There was something in his expression, even from a distance, that suggested he was carrying a burden that extended far beyond his professional duties. George had always been curious about the guards who protected his family. He often wondered about their lives outside the castle walls, their families, their hopes and concerns. His parents had taught him that these men and women made significant sacrifices to serve the crown, often spending long hours away from their own families to ensure the safety of the royal family. As he continued to observe, George noticed that Guard Mitchell seemed to be in some physical discomfort. The way he occasionally shifted his stance, the slight grimace that crossed his face when he thought no one was looking, and the way he seemed to be favoring one leg all suggested that he might be in pain. George felt a growing concern for the man who had stood faithfully at his post despite whatever personal challenges he might be facing. The young prince had been raised to understand that with privilege comes responsibility. His parents had instilled in him the belief that those who are fortunate enough to have resources and opportunities should use them to help others whenever possible. This wasn't just about grand gestures or public charitable works, but about everyday acts of kindness and consideration for those around them. George remembered a conversation he had with his father just a few weeks earlier about the importance of noticing when people needed help, even when they didn't ask for it. Prince William had explained that sometimes the people who serve others most faithfully are the least likely to seek help for themselves, and that true leadership meant being aware of their needs and finding ways to support them. As the afternoon progressed, George found it increasingly difficult to concentrate on his lessons. His tutor, Mrs. Henderson, had noticed his distraction and gently redirected his attention to his mathematics several times. But George's mind kept returning to the scene outside his window. He couldn't shake the feeling that Guard Mitchell was struggling with something significant. During his break time, George decided to learn more about the guard who had captured his attention. He knew that asking direct questions about staff members wasn't always appropriate, but he also knew that his parents had always encouraged him to show genuine interest in the people who worked around them. He approached Mrs. Henderson, who had been with the family for several years and knew many of the castle staff. "Mrs. Henderson," George said carefully, "the guard outside my window today, the older gentleman with the gray hair, has he been working here for a long time?" Mrs. Henderson looked out the window and recognized Thomas Mitchell immediately. "Oh yes, Your Royal Highness, that's Guard Mitchell. He's been serving your family since before your father was born. He's one of our most dedicated and respected guards. He seems like he might not be feeling well today," George observed. "Is there anything we should be concerned about?" Mrs. Henderson was impressed by George's perceptiveness, but also aware that she needed to be careful about discussing staff personal matters. "Guard Mitchell is a very professional man who takes his duties seriously. If he's on duty, you can be assured that he's capable of performing his responsibilities." But George's concern wasn't satisfied by this diplomatic response. He had learned to read between the lines of adult conversations, and he sensed that there might be more to the story. His parents had taught him that sometimes people needed help even when they appeared to be managing fine on their own. Later that afternoon, George overheard a brief conversation between two housekeeping staff members as they passed by his study room. They were speaking in low voices, but he caught fragments that made his heart sink. Something about medical bills, extra shifts, and financial worries. While they didn't mention Guard Mitchell by name, George's intuition told him that these concerns might be connected to the man he had been observing. The young prince spent the rest of the afternoon thinking about what he had learned and observed. He knew that his position afforded him certain privileges and opportunities that most people didn't have. His parents had always taught him that these advantages came with the responsibility to help others when possible, especially those who had devoted their lives to serving his family. As evening approached, George made a decision that would demonstrate wisdom and compassion far beyond his years. He realized that sometimes the most meaningful gestures weren't grand public displays, but quiet acts of kindness that acknowledged someone's dignity and worth. He began to formulate a plan that would honor Guard Mitchell's years of faithful service, while addressing what he suspected might be a time of personal difficulty for the dedicated man. That evening, George found himself unable to concentrate on his usual activities. During dinner with his family, he was quieter than usual, lost in thought about Guard Mitchell and what he had observed. His mother, Princess Catherine, noticed his subdued mood and asked if everything was all right. George simply nodded and said he was thinking about something important, which was certainly true. After dinner, George retreated to his room and spent considerable time looking through his personal belongings. He had always been taught to value his possessions not for their monetary worth, but for their sentimental significance and the memories they represented. Among his treasures was a collection of items that held special meaning to him, gifts from family members, mementos from important occasions, and personal keepsakes that marked significant moments in his young life. One item in particular caught his attention as he searched through his belongings. It was a gold pocket watch that had been given to him by his great-grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, on his 8th birthday. The watch was an antique piece, beautifully crafted and engraved with the royal coat of arms. When she had presented it to him, the Queen had explained that it had belonged to her own father, King George VI, and that it represented the continuity of service and duty that defined their family. The watch held immense sentimental value for George, but as he held it in his hands that evening, he began to think about its significance in a different way. His great-grandmother had told him stories about his namesake, King George VI, and how he had led the country through some of its most difficult times with courage and compassion. She had emphasized that true leadership meant putting the needs of others before your own comfort and convenience. George spent a long time that night thinking about Guard Mitchell's years of faithful service. He imagined the man standing at his post through countless seasons, protecting George's family through good times and difficult periods. He thought about the guard's dedication, his professionalism, and the quiet dignity with which he performed his duties day after day, year after year. The young prince also thought about the conversation fragments he had overheard and the signs of strain he had observed in Guard Mitchell's demeanor. He couldn't be certain about the specific nature of the guard's challenges, But his instincts told him that this was a man who was facing difficulties while continuing to serve others, with unwavering commitment. As George held the pocket watch, he began to formulate a plan. He knew that simply offering money or assistance directly might embarrass Guard Mitchell or put him in an uncomfortable position. The guard's pride and professionalism would likely prevent him from accepting charity, especially from a member of the royal family he was sworn to protect. George needed to find a way to help that would preserve the man's dignity while acknowledging his years of service. The next morning, George woke early and spent time carefully crafting a handwritten note. His penmanship had improved significantly over the past year, and he wanted to ensure that his message was clear and heartfelt. He wrote and rewrote the note several times, wanting to strike the right tone that would convey his respect and gratitude without seeming patronizing or inappropriate. In his final version, George wrote about his observation of Guard Mitchell's dedication and professionalism. He mentioned how he had noticed the guard's unwavering commitment to duty and how this had impressed him. He wrote about learning from his parents and great-grandmother about the importance of recognizing and honoring those who serve others, and how Guard Mitchell exemplified the best qualities of service and dedication. The most challenging part of the note was finding the right words to accompany his gesture. George wanted to make it clear that the pocket watch was not charity, but rather a token of recognition and respect for Guard Mitchell's years of faithful service. He wrote that he hoped the watch might serve as a reminder that his service had been noticed and appreciated, and that it came with the gratitude of the entire royal family. George also included in his note a request that Guard Mitchell not feel obligated to accept the gift if it made him uncomfortable, but that he hoped the guard would understand it was offered in the spirit of mutual respect between people who understood the meaning of duty and service. He emphasized that the watch had been given to him as a symbol of service to others, and that he felt Guard Mitchell embodied those same values. After finishing the note, George carefully wrapped the pocket watch in a simple cloth and placed both items in a small, discreet envelope. He spent considerable time deciding on the best way to deliver his gift without causing embarrassment or drawing unwanted attention to Guard Mitchell. He knew that any grand gesture or public presentation would defeat the purpose of his intended kindness. George decided that the most appropriate approach would be to deliver the gift quietly and personally, in a way that would allow Guard Mitchell to receive it with dignity and privacy. He planned to wait for an opportune moment when he could approach the guard's post without creating a scene or interrupting his duties. The young prince understood that his gesture might be misunderstood or rejected, but he felt compelled to act on his instincts about Guard Mitchell's situation. His parents had taught him that sometimes doing the right thing required taking risks and accepting that your intentions might not always be received as you hoped. But they had also taught him that the potential for making a positive difference in someone's life was worth those risks. As George prepared for the day ahead, he felt a mixture of nervousness and determination. He knew that what he was planning was unusual, and that it might raise questions about protocol and propriety. But he also knew that his great-grandmother and his parents had always emphasized the importance of individual acts of kindness and recognition, especially toward those who served others without seeking recognition for themselves. The pocket watch felt heavier in his hands than it ever had before, not because of its physical weight, but because of the significance of what it represented and what he hoped it might mean to Guard Mitchell. The following morning arrived with a crisp autumn breeze that rustled through the castle grounds. George had barely slept, his mind racing with thoughts about his planned gesture. He had rehearsed in his head how he would approach Guard Mitchell, what he would say and how he might handle various reactions. Despite his careful planning, he felt nervous about executing his plan. After breakfast, George learned that Guard Mitchell was once again assigned to the East Wing post where he had been the previous day. This seemed like providence to the young prince, as it was the same location where he had first noticed the guard's apparent discomfort. George spent the morning watching from his window, waiting for the right moment to approach. Around mid-morning, George noticed that the usual foot traffic around the East Wing had diminished. Most of the staff were engaged in their regular duties in other parts of the castle, and the area around Guard Mitchell's post was relatively quiet. George realized that this might be his best opportunity to approach without drawing unwanted attention or disrupting the guard's duties. George carefully tucked the wrapped pocket watch and note into his jacket pocket and made his way downstairs. His heart was beating rapidly as he walked through the corridors toward the east wing. He had never done anything quite like this before, and he wasn't entirely sure how it would be received. But the image of Guard Mitchell's strained expression and obvious discomfort kept motivating him forward. As George approached the area where Guard Mitchell was stationed, he slowed his pace and tried to appear casual. He didn't want to startle the guard or create a situation that might compromise the man's professional composure. George had observed enough interactions between royals and guards to know that maintaining proper protocol was important to the guard's sense of professionalism and dignity. When George was about 10 feet away from Guard Mitchell's position, he cleared his throat softly to announce his presence. As expected, the guard's eyes remained fixed straight ahead, but George could see a slight acknowledgement in the man's posture that indicated he was aware of the young prince's approach. "Good morning, Guard Mitchell," George said quietly, using the formal address he had learned was appropriate when speaking to castle staff during their duties. "I hope I'm not interrupting your important work." Thomas Mitchell felt a surge of surprise at being addressed directly by Prince George. In his 30 years of service, he had rarely been spoken to personally by members of the royal family, except for formal occasions or specific instructions. He maintained his forward gaze but responded with the appropriate formal acknowledgement. "Good morning, Your Royal Highness. You are never an interruption, sir." George moved slightly closer, positioning himself where he could speak quietly without requiring Guard Mitchell to break his professional stance. "Guard Mitchell, I've been thinking about something, and I wondered if I might share it with you." The formality of George's approach impressed Thomas, who had observed the young prince's development over the years but had never had a personal conversation with him. Despite his surprise at this unusual interaction, Thomas remained professionally composed while giving George his attention. "I've been watching from my window, and I've noticed how dedicated you are to your duties," George continued, his voice carrying a maturity that seemed beyond his years. "I've seen you stand at your post even when it appears you might not be feeling your best. And I wanted you to know that your commitment hasn't gone unnoticed." Thomas felt a wave of emotion that he struggled to suppress. The young prince's words touched something deep inside him, especially during this difficult period when he felt invisible and overwhelmed by his personal challenges. But he maintained his professional demeanor, unsure of how to respond to such unexpected recognition. George reached into his pocket and withdrew the small wrapped package. "I have something that I'd like you to have if you're willing to accept it. It's not charity or pity, but rather a token of respect from someone who recognizes the value of faithful service." Thomas's eyes briefly shifted to look at the package in George's hands before returning to their forward position. He was deeply moved by the gesture, but also concerned about the appropriateness of accepting a gift from a member of the royal family while on duty. "Your Royal Highness," Thomas said quietly, "I am deeply honored by your kindness, but I'm not sure it would be proper for me to accept a gift while performing my duties." George had anticipated this response and was prepared for it. "I understand your concern about protocol, Guard Mitchell, and I respect your professionalism. But I've spoken with my parents about recognizing good service, and they've taught me that sometimes acknowledging someone's dedication is more important than following every rule exactly." This wasn't entirely true, as George hadn't specifically discussed this gesture with his parents, but he felt confident that they would approve of his intentions if they knew about them. He also knew that invoking their authority might help Guard Mitchell feel more comfortable accepting the gift. "The item I'm offering belonged to my great-great-grandfather, King George VI, George continued. "When it was given to me, I was told that it should go to someone who understands the meaning of service and duty. I believe that person is you." Thomas felt his composure beginning to waver. The significance of what Prince George was offering, combined with the thoughtfulness behind the gesture, was overwhelming. He had spent his entire adult life serving the royal family, asking for nothing in return except the honor of that service. To be recognized in such a personal and meaningful way by the young prince was beyond anything he had ever imagined. "I don't know what to say, Your Royal Highness," Thomas managed, his voice slightly hoarse with emotion. "You don't need to say anything," George replied gently. "Just know that your service matters, that it's seen and appreciated, and that you represent the very best of what it means to serve others." George carefully placed the wrapped package on a small ledge near Guard Mitchell's post, where it would be easily accessible, but wouldn't interfere with his duties. "When your shift ends, Please consider this a small token of the gratitude that my family and I feel for your years of faithful service." As George turned to walk away, he paused and looked back at Guard Mitchell one more time. "And Guard Mitchell, if you ever need anything, please remember that those who serve my family are valued members of our extended family as well." Thomas Mitchell stood frozen at his post for several minutes after Prince George had walked away, his mind struggling to process what had just occurred. In all his years of service, he had never experienced anything remotely like this interaction. The small wrapped package sat on the ledge beside him, seeming to radiate significance far beyond its physical size. The remaining hours of his shift passed in a blur of conflicting emotions. Thomas found himself fighting back tears multiple times, overwhelmed by the unexpected recognition and kindness from someone he had devoted his life to protecting. The weight of his personal struggles, which had been crushing him for months, suddenly felt lighter in the face of this extraordinary gesture. When his replacement guard arrived for the evening shift, Thomas carefully picked up the package that Prince George had left for him. His hands trembled slightly as he held it, knowing that whatever was inside represented something far more valuable than any material object could be. Thomas made his way to a quiet area of the castle where staff members could have privacy during their breaks. With reverent care, he unwrapped the cloth covering and found an exquisite gold pocket watch, along with a folded piece of paper. The watch was clearly antique and beautifully crafted, with engravings that immediately identified it as a piece of royal heritage. With shaking hands, Thomas unfolded the note and began to read Prince George's carefully written words. As he read about the young prince's observations of his dedication, his commitment to duty, and the recognition of his years of faithful service, Thomas felt emotions welling up that he had been suppressing for months. The note went on to explain the history of the pocket watch and its significance as a symbol of service to others. Prince George had written that he felt Guard Mitchell embodied the same values of duty and sacrifice that the watch represented, and that he hoped it would serve as a reminder that his service had been noticed and deeply appreciated. Thomas sat in stunned silence for several minutes, reading and rereading the note. The thoughtfulness behind the gesture, the maturity of the young prince's words, and the profound respect shown for his years of service overwhelmed him completely. For the first time in months, Thomas felt tears of gratitude rather than despair. But it was the final paragraph of the note that truly broke through Thomas's emotional barriers. Prince George had written about learning that those who serve others faithfully often face their own challenges without seeking help, and that he hoped this small gesture might provide some assistance during what he suspected might be a difficult time. Enclosed with the note was something that Thomas hadn't initially noticed in his emotional state. Prince George had included contact information for a private charitable fund that helped castle staff and their families during times of medical or financial crisis. The note explained that this fund existed specifically to support people like Thomas, who had dedicated their lives to royal service. Thomas realized that somehow, Prince George had understood not just his professional dedication, but also his personal struggles. The young prince had found a way to offer help that preserved Thomas's dignity, while providing practical assistance for his wife's medical needs. The pocket watch itself was clearly valuable, but Thomas understood that its true worth lay in what it represented. This was not just an expensive gift, but a symbol of recognition, respect, and inclusion in something larger than himself. Prince George had seen him not as just another faceless guard, but as an individual whose service and sacrifices mattered. Thomas carefully returned the watch to its wrapping and placed both items securely in his inner pocket. He needed time to fully process what had happened and to decide how to respond appropriately to such an extraordinary gesture. His first instinct was to find Prince George immediately and express his gratitude, but his professional training reminded him that there were proper channels and protocols for such interactions. Over the next few days, Thomas found himself transformed by Prince George's gesture. The constant weight of worry that had been affecting his performance and his health seemed to lift significantly. He walked taller, stood straighter, and felt a renewed sense of purpose in his duties. More practically, Thomas contacted the charitable fund that Prince George had mentioned in his note. He learned that the fund was indeed legitimate and had been established specifically to help royal staff during times of crisis. The fund's administrators were discreet, professional, and understanding of his situation. Within a week, arrangements had been made to cover Margaret's medical expenses through the fund. The relief Thomas felt was indescribable. For months he had been carrying the crushing burden of watching his wife suffer, while feeling helpless to provide adequate care. Now, thanks to Prince George's intervention, Margaret could receive the treatment she needed without financial constraints. Thomas also learned more about the pocket watch through discreet inquiries with senior staff members. It was indeed a piece of significant royal heritage, having belonged to King George VI and later passed down to Queen Elizabeth II before being given to Prince George. The fact that the young prince had chosen to give away such a precious family heirloom made the gesture even more meaningful. The transformation in Thomas was noticed by his fellow guards and supervisors. His renewed energy and focus were evident to everyone who worked with him. Several colleagues commented on how much better he seemed, though Thomas kept the details of Prince George's gesture private, sharing only that his family's situation had improved. But perhaps the most significant change in Thomas was his perspective on his role and his value as a person. Prince George's recognition had reminded him that his years of faithful service mattered, that he was seen and appreciated, and that his dedication had not gone unnoticed. This validation came at a time when Thomas had been questioning his worth and wondering if his sacrifices had been meaningless. The pocket watch became Thomas's most treasured possession, not for its monetary value, but for what it represented about human dignity, royal compassion, and the unexpected ways that kindness could transform someone's life. He carried it with him every day, not as a reminder of his own importance, but as a symbol of the values he had always tried to uphold in his service. Several weeks after Prince George's extraordinary gesture, the true measure of its impact became clear in ways that neither the young prince nor Guard Mitchell could have anticipated. The ripple effects of that moment of compassion extended far beyond a single act of kindness between two individuals. Thomas Mitchell's transformation was remarkable to witness. His renewed vigor and dedication were evident to everyone who worked with him, but more importantly, his personal life had been restored to stability. Margaret's medical treatments were proceeding successfully, funded by the Royal Staff Charitable Fund that Prince George had brought to his attention. The crushing financial burden that had been destroying their peace of mind was lifted, allowing them both to focus on her recovery. But the most significant change in Thomas was internal. The recognition he had received from Prince George had rekindled his sense of purpose and self-worth. He began mentoring younger guards, sharing his decades of experience and helping them understand that their role was about more than just standing at attention. He taught them about the honor of service, the importance of dignity in their duties, and the pride that came from protecting something larger than themselves. Prince George, meanwhile, had learned valuable lessons about leadership and the power of individual action. His parents, when they eventually learned about his gesture, were initially surprised but ultimately proud of their son's initiative and compassion. Princess Catherine and Prince William recognized that George had demonstrated wisdom and empathy that went far beyond his years. The story of Prince George's gift to Guard Mitchell became known among the castle staff, though details were kept private out of respect for both individuals involved. The gesture became a symbol of the values that the royal family represented at their best: recognition of service, compassion for others, and the understanding that true nobility comes from how one treats those who serve them. Other members of the royal family began to pay more attention to the staff who worked tirelessly around them. Small gestures of recognition and appreciation became more common, creating an atmosphere where the dedicated men and women who maintained the royal households felt valued and seen. The culture of mutual respect that had always existed was strengthened and made more visible. For Thomas, the decision about when to step down from active duty came naturally rather than being forced by circumstances. With Margaret's health improving and their financial stability restored, he was able to make the choice based on what was best for his family, rather than being driven by desperation or physical limitations. When Thomas finally submitted his request for retirement 6 months later, it was with dignity and on his own terms. He had trained his replacement thoroughly, ensuring a smooth transition that maintained the high standards of the Royal Guard. His departure was marked by ceremonies and recognition that honored his 3 decades of faithful service. Prince George attended Thomas's retirement ceremony, where he publicly acknowledged the Guard's years of dedication. In his brief remarks, the young prince spoke about learning valuable lessons about service and dedication from observing guards like Thomas Mitchell. He emphasized that the true strength of the monarchy lay not just in its traditions and ceremonies, but in the character of the people who served it faithfully day after day. During the private moments after the ceremony, Thomas approached Prince George to express his gratitude one final time. The pocket watch, which he now carried every day, had become a source of strength and pride. Thomas told the young prince that his gesture had taught him that service was not just about giving of oneself, but also about accepting recognition and help when it was offered with genuine respect. Prince George, now slightly older and even more mature, told Thomas that their interaction had taught him equally valuable lessons about leadership and compassion. He had learned that sometimes the most important actions were not the grand public gestures, but the quiet moments of human connection that acknowledged someone's worth and dignity. Thomas's retirement years were spent in comfort and contentment with Margaret, whose health had stabilized significantly thanks to the medical care she was able to receive. They often spoke about the young prince's intervention as a turning point that had saved not just their financial security, but their hope for the future. The pocket watch remained Thomas's most treasured possession, but he also began to think about its future. He discussed with Margaret his desire to eventually return the watch to Prince George when the young man reached adulthood, along with a letter explaining how the gesture had changed their lives. Thomas felt that the watch should ultimately remain within the royal family, but he wanted Prince George to know the full impact of his compassion. Years later, when Prince George had grown into a young man preparing for his own royal duties, Thomas did indeed return the pocket watch. But this time it came with additional significance. It had become a symbol of the connection between the royal family and those who served them. A reminder that true leadership was measured not by the power one wielded, but by the compassion one showed to others. The story of Prince George's hidden gesture became part of the unofficial history of the royal family, passed down among staff members as an example of the values that defined the monarchy at its best. It served as a reminder that sometimes the most profound impacts come from the smallest gestures, and that recognizing the dignity and worth of every individual is the foundation of true leadership. For Prince George, that moment with Guard Mitchell became a defining experience that shaped his understanding of his role and responsibilities. He learned that being royal was not about privilege and ceremony, but about service to others, and the recognition that everyone deserves to be seen, valued, and treated with dignity. The hidden gesture had indeed surprised the Guard, but its true power lay in how it transformed both individuals involved and created ripples of positive change that extended far beyond that single moment of unexpected kindness.